Good morning. My name is Curtis Mann, and I was born in Frankfurt.
Excuse me, Mr. Mann, we can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Or did they disconnect this mic? I'm not sure. Is this mic working? Yes. Okay. As I said, my name is Curtis Mann. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1926. I was a young boy when most of these events that we talk about took place. I'm Jewish, and that makes, of course, a big difference, or did in the terms of the history that we're talking about. Hitler came to power in 1933, and you've heard about that already this morning, I'm sure. And he had a pathological hatred for the Jews, and that culminated in some of the atrocities that you heard about. This all kind of started with a boycott of Jewish businesses in 1933, and from then on, things became progressively worse in Germany. The Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935. A couple of years later, the Nuremberg laws were called that because they were enacted in Nuremberg, and they deprived Jews of citizenship. German Jews were no longer citizens of Germany and didn't have any equal rights or access to the courts or anything else for that matter. And in the course of the next few years, things became progressively worse. Lawyers couldn't practice law, doctors couldn't practice medicine, except perhaps to a few Jewish patients. It was a funny thing. At that time, nobody could foresee what was going to happen in the future. At least most people didn't foresee what happened. The motto was, things are bad, but they can't get any worse. Except, of course, it did. As history tells us, things got progressively worse. My brother, I had an older brother who 8.5 years older than I. He left Germany in 1938, in the spring of 1938, because my mother, who was the head of the family, my father having died in 1928, my mother foresaw that there really wasn't any future for a young Jewish boy in Germany. So she found the means for him to emigrate to the United States, and he did. When I try to describe how it feels to live in a situation of a dictatorship, it's like you put your hand is put into a vice, and at the beginning it doesn't hurt very much, it's just kind of uncomfortable. But as the vice is turned, it begins to pain more and more until it becomes intolerable. And that's how life was in a dictatorship in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. People tended to become very afraid of the fact that they were going to be overheard by their neighbors, and as a result, if they had anything to say to each other which was not approved, they would speak in whispers. There was another thing that was typical of what, you guys know what a tea cozy is? No, you don't know what a tea cozy is. A tea cozy is a cover for a teapot, it's sort of a quilted material, and this thing people put over the telephone in their home because they were afraid that their conversations could be overheard, or if they spoke out loud. So in order to deaden the sound, and because they were afraid that the telephones could be tapped without their knowledge, they put these tea cozies over the telephone. This is part of the paranoia that took place at that time. Children were encouraged to snitch on their parents. If their parents said anything that was contrary to the prevailing view of the Nazi regime, they could find out that their children had snitched on them, which is a very unfortunate thing, but it did happen. In the spring of 1938, a decree came down that Jews had to make lists of all gold, silver, paintings, precious stones, Persian rugs, and so forth. And that was sort of an indication of things to come. My mother had a business. She was in the wholesale flour business, Flour, that kind of flour. And she found that her business was being slowly strangled, in the sense that pressure was put on the mills that sold the flour not to sell to Jews, and pressure was put on her customers not to buy from Jews. So pretty soon, in 1938, her ability to conduct a business came to an end. So in the summer of 1938, my mother applied for a visa to come for her and me to come to the United States. And instead of routinely getting such a visa, by the way, can you hear me? Okay. Instead of getting such a visa, she got a letter from the American consul in Stuttgart, which said, here's your number. Your turn will come up in approximately 5 years. And of course, we couldn't wait 5 years in 1938, and thank goodness we didn't. In due course, in 1939, I was able to get out of Germany, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you first about Kristallnacht. You perhaps have heard already about Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, they call it. I know there was reference made to it in the film that you saw. Kristallnacht was the night of November 9, November 10, 1938. And a lot of things happened all at the same time. I didn't know anything unusual was happening, so I was on my bicycle and I rode to the Jewish school that I went to, because at that time I could no longer go to a general school. I had to go to a Jewish school. I was 12 years old, 12 and a half years old, and as I pulled in the schoolyard, there was a kid who said, "Oh, I passed by such and such a synagogue and it was on fire." And then another kid came and said, "Oh, I went by another synagogue and it was burning." And a third, and pretty soon we were hearing about all these synagogues that are on fire, all the fires having been set, and the firemen didn't do anything to put the fires out. So in due course, about 45 minutes late, the bell rang for us to go to class. We went to class and we were sent home. Why were we sent home? Because the administration of the school was afraid that the school might be torched next. So they thought the better part of wisdom was to send the kids home. I came home, it was about 9:30 in the morning, and my mother, who was home, said, "What are you doing home?" So I told her, I said, "All the synagogues are on fire." She said, "What?" She hadn't heard anything about this. So she then called some people on the telephone, and was able to confirm what was going on. Now, simultaneously with the burning of the synagogues or the destruction of the Jewish-owned businesses, which were destroyed and sometimes plundered, and also simultaneously men ranging in age from 18 to 60, some were younger, some were older, were arrested and taken to concentration camps. They were not death camps at that point, but people were badly treated in those camps, even then in 1938. So businesses were destroyed, synagogues were torched, and then also at the same time they started going into homes of Jews and destroying those homes, turning over china cabinets, slashing pictures, slashing bedding, and generally creating havoc of the places of residence. It was my fortune to live in the west end of Frankfurt because they started on the east side and worked their way west, never got quite to our apartment, which spared us that aggravation. I said that people were treated badly in the concentration camp. They were beaten. When they were arrested, they didn't have winter clothes, and it was a cold November. So many of them suffered. I had a teacher who was among those who were arrested and sent to the concentration camp in 1938, and he developed frostbite, then followed by gangrene, and ultimately lost a leg. That was just an example of some of the mistreatment. They all had their heads shaved, and they lost a tremendous amount of weight when they came out of the camps, because by the first of the year of 1939, the remaining number of men were released. Earlier on, you could get out of the concentration camp if you could show proof that you had a way to get out of the country. But many people did not have a way out, so they had to wait until they were released. And released they were finally in the very early part of January, and that's when school started again for me, because I had been out of school for about 2 months. I had a cousin in England, sort of like a second cousin, and she found a family which was willing to take me in. I was by that time 13. Actually, I got word of it on the day of my bar mitzvah. You know what a bar mitzvah is? Okay. On the day of my bar mitzvah, I got a 2-word telegram. It said family found, which meant that a family was found that would take me in. In the November of 1938, November 24, I think it was, of 1938, the British Parliament had a bill that was offered to let 10,000 kids into England from Central Europe who were persecuted for one reason or another. Most of them were Jewish kids. And the amazing thing is that this bill got 3 readings on the same day and was passed by the House of Commons. And in due course, just 6 days later, the first trainload of kids came out of Central Europe and into England. I was fortunate to be one of the ones who got out on April 19, 1939, I was on the train out of England, out of Germany, took us across the border into Holland, and then ultimately by ship from Holland to England, where we arrived the next day. It was kind of a long journey. It was a strange experience. I had that experience twice in my life, and that is a feeling of like a huge weight being lifted off my shoulders. And that's the feeling that I had when I came out of Germany and crossed the border into Holland. I was now no longer living under a dictatorship, and I didn't have to be constantly afraid of being arrested and all the rest of that stuff. Now, in the same coach in which I was a passenger, there was a little girl, and after we crossed into Holland, she said, "I'm sure glad they didn't search us," because they hadn't searched us. And she said, "Because I have 10 mark in my shoe." That's the equivalent of about $2 or $3, which was horrendously stupid on her parents' part, because they could have, had they searched her and found the money, they could have turned the whole group around. There were 300 kids on the train, and about six adults, and fortunately we were not. The missing money was not discovered, and as a result, nothing untoward happened. Anyhow, as I started to say, I was on the Kindertransport, and we, like I said, crossed the channel, and then by train we went to London. We got off the train, and we were sent to a large gym where chairs had been set up, like chairs are set up here, and they would start to call kids by name, and I was afraid that I wouldn't understand the name calling because of the different way that my name was pronounced in German from the way it was pronounced in English. So I asked about it. "Have you called my name yet?" And I was told, "No, we haven't called you yet." And so I returned to my seat, and a little while later I asked again. I said, "Have you called my name yet?" And they said, "No, the people, other kids were being picked up one after another, and I was being left among the last few to be picked up." And finally I was told, "Well, you're not going to be picked up. You're going to be taken a train to Birchington, which is a little town in southeast England." And so in due course, I was taken by a couple of fellows to a different railroad station in London. And making a long story short, I was a train that we thought was the right train was getting ready to pull out, and they quickly pushed me on the train and went ahead and said something to the conductor, and the train is pulling out, and I'm on the train. Now, I don't have a penny in my pocket, not 1 cent. I just knew the name of the town that I was going to, and that's all I really knew. So in due course, the conductor came into our compartment, and he said something to me, and he was talking in broad Cockney accent, and I had no idea what he was talking about, none. So he repeated it a second time, and I still didn't know what he was saying. And he repeated it a third time, and I still didn't know what he was saying. And finally he went on his business to check other people's tickets and whatnot. And I had no idea what the man was saying. What he was saying, I found out, was that I was on the wrong train. I needed to change trains. Part of the problem was I didn't know what the word change meant. So I was missing an element of the language that I didn't have at that time. So there was a nice man in my compartment who kind of took pity on me, and he explained to me that I needed to go from this train to another train with the aid of diagrams and gestures and whatnot. I finally found out what he was trying to tell me. So I said to him, when do I get off? And he said, well, he finally said, 3 stops after I get off. So he got off, and it was like a sort of a local train. I made a number of stops. And in due course, we got to the 3rd stop, and I got off. I'm on the station platform, and there's a railroad worker at the far end of the platform. So I tried to communicate with him as best as I could, and how do I get to Birchington? So he said, well, there's another train coming along in 45 minutes. You can take it. So I did, and when I got to Birchington, the family that was taking me in was waiting for me, and the first words they said, where have you been? I was cruising around the countryside, not knowing where I was going, and not knowing I was on the wrong train. It was just part of the experience that I had as a young kid. I'm not telling you concentration camp stories because I was never in a concentration camp until after the war when I saw the inside of Dachau, but never as a prisoner, thank the Lord. I'll tell you one more story, and then I'll let you ask me questions if you wish. I had a couple of experiences. I went to school in England with my limited English. I had had English since I was 10. I'm now 13. Okay? My vocabulary isn't as broad as it could have been, but I did the best I could. And I went to one of my classes was a course in English history. And English history is one long list of battles. Battle of Hastings in 1066, and this battle and that battle. And I'm sitting there, I have no idea what the word battle meant. And they're talking about battles, and it was going right over my head. And although I did very well in math, I didn't do well in English history at all. The teacher thought I wasn't making any effort. Actually, I was so frustrated because aside from the fact that I didn't know what the word like battle meant, I had, trouble understanding what was going on. I'll tell you one more anecdote, and then I'll let you ask me questions. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but part of my problem was that the large suitcase, not a small suitcase that I carry on, and a large suitcase got lost for 6 months, and I didn't have the benefit of the clothes I brought, nor my English-German dictionary, which I badly needed in the beginning, and it was in the luggage, and for the first few months I had to struggle along without the dictionary, which was really something else. Now, I'll tell you one more anecdote, and that is, I lived with this English family. There was a man and his wife, and they had a 12-year-old son, and I was supposed to be like a companion for the son. And the lady was very much the boss of the house. In fact, her husband called her Queenie, give you some idea. So one day, Queenie baked a pie. Now, I don't remember if it was a fruit pie or a meat pie. It doesn't really make any difference. She asked me, did you like the pie? And I was trying very hard to come up with a positive response. So in answer to the question, and I wanted to show her that I really, really liked the pie, And in answer to the question, did you like the pie? My answer was, I should hardly think so. To me, the word hardly was a word of emphasis and not a negative word as it exists in the English language. But that's the kind of trouble I would get into from time to time. She didn't talk to me for 2 weeks after that. All right, well, I think that's enough anecdotes. Why don't we see if anybody has any questions, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can.